Every year, in anticipation of the Finance Minister's Union budget, individuals like you and me usually wait for that one section of the budget, and that's taxes. Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to affect how much money will you get in your wallet net of taxes. And hence, what's going to be the rejig, then the direct tax rate that the Finance Minister is going to announce. That's the topic that I'll be discussing today. And for that, I have with me Divya Baweja, who is the partner with Deloitte India, and from the industry, Renu Narvekar, who is the global tax head with Tata Consultancy Services. So thank you so much for joining me on this very special budget show. I'm going to start off with you first, Divya. And like I mentioned, and at least personally for me, at the end of the day, yes, fiscal deficit, GDP, all of those are great from a macro standpoint. And then I'm going to wait for when the Finance Minister will say that, you know, the direct tax slab is going to be whatever it's going to be. And this time around, the hope is that there is going to be a rationalization of slabs. There is going to be a rejig of the slabs, the rates as well. So, Divya, as the economy stands right now, we are staring at this entire consumption slowdown. People are saying that, hey, you've got to give more disposable income in the hands of the Indians. Do you think, are you expecting any sort of big rejig this time around by Nirmala Sitharaman?
So, in fact, if you see what the Finance Minister has been indicating in the last few months, that there is going to be a rejig in the personal tax rate. I agree there's a fiscal deficit issue which is happening, but yes, also there's time to have more disposable income in hands of the individuals, and with corporate tax rates going down earlier to 25% and maybe lower 17% for new companies, it's time that the individual tax rates also need a rejig and the slabs also need to be changed in the better of the employees or individuals, I would say.
Yeah. So I think there's also an expectation that you all want the exemption limits to almost double from 2.5 lakh rupees to 5 lakh rupees. But again, like you're mentioning, the entire fiscal deficit constraints, because if we are talking about a hike in exemption limit, that's almost 12,500. That's roughly the savings for everybody earning more than 5 lakhs, because you have that 12,500 rebate. So do you think that's a likelihood? Because I think the last time the exemption limit was raised was at least 4 to 5 years ago.
Yes, you're right. Last time the exemption limit was raised was almost 6 years back.
Okay.
And it's time to do that because, as you said also, that the way the economy is today, people need more disposable income in hand, and that can come only if the tax rates are slashed. And it's time the government looks at that, and which is what the Finance Minister has been indicating also.
Okay. Renu, back in 2013, FM Chidambaram had said that, okay, I'm going to impose this temporary surcharge on the super rich. And I think we can remove the word temporary, because every year, not only has that surcharge rate been increasing, but we've also had different now levels of surcharge being inserted for different levels of income. So the average tax rate for the rich and the super rich is only increasing. Do you think it's high time that the Finance Minister gives that a look? Or again, do you think the focus should be on the the lower income or the middle income, and that's where perhaps the FM will want to keep her focus on?
Yeah. So I think, Mubina, it's I would say all salaried people need that relief. It's got nothing to do with the super rich and the middle class and lower class. So I think the ask of every salaried employee would be, the starting point should be 5 lakhs. Okay. So the current structure is about no tax till about 2.5 lakhs. And then you have a rate of 5% between 2.5 and 5. Yeah. The recommendation would be that if you can start with 5 lakhs and have a 10% tax rate. So currently between 5 and 10 lakhs, it's taxed at 10%, 20%, right? Yeah. So maybe you make that at 10%, but the starting point should be 5 lakhs. And then you have a new slab, which is 10 to 20 lakhs. Make that about 20%. And then over 20%, you have the maximum tax rate. Okay. And when I say maximum tax rate, today I know it's 30%, which, like you rightly said, with the surcharge and the cess and all, it becomes a very huge number. Maybe have a cap the tax rate at 25%.
Okay, so the highest tax rate as well should be at 25 as opposed to 30%. And you know, the other part of this conversation, you mentioned salaried, right? And as opposed to a professional or a businessman, the ammunition available for a salaried person for, you know, tax management or tax planning is very limited, which brings me to the other two bits, that's Section ATC and standard deduction. Let's start by, you know, talking about Section ATC. For a very long time, people have been complaining that you can't expect us to pay school fees, invest in Provident Fund, have your, your public Provident Fund, EPF, and all the other instruments that are eligible for ATC, and expect us to use all of it to exhaust only a limit of 1,50,000. So do you think that is as well the need of the hour?
It definitely is. Because like you rightly said, I think this 1.5 lakhs limit has been constant since 2014.
Yeah.
So cost of living has gone up, inflation has been on the rise, and ATC, like you rightly said, is probably the predominant tax saving incentive for salaried income. Now, given the cost of inflation, and the fact is ATC was actually introduced to give specified relief on investments and expenditure. Okay, but over the years, what has happened, the scope of ATC has widened. So you have Provident Fund, you have annuity, you have excuse me, payment of your principal of housing loan, you have tuition fees. So I think it's become a mixed bag, and the limit of 150 has remained constant. So I think it's high time that we need to get real, look at the limit of ATC. I think also maybe carve out only for investment based, and look at expenditure separately, because what is happening currently, this 1.5 lakh is actually getting eaten up by your investment in, say, Provident Fund, tuition fees and life insurance premium. So there's really no saving that individual would really like to have. In fact, I think the contribution to PF itself should be hiked to about 3 lakhs itself.
Okay, for PF alone. All right, okay. Now this brings me to the direct tax code. I mean, it's still extremely early days. We've been talking about this, I think, for the last 9 to 10 odd years, if I'm not mistaken. And only recently we had, the task force's recommendations that were released. And the hope is that maybe this budget will sort of start prepping the country towards having the direct tax code. So, Divya, over to you then. What parts of perhaps those recommendations do you see implemented in this budget, or do you hope should be implemented in this budget?
I think the key thing which needs to be implemented is the ATC, what Renu also mentioned. And it's time to really rejig Section ATC. If we go back to 2010, when the Direct Taxes Code was initially, released, there was a specific mention that the avenues for investment in ATC should be pruned. Even the limit should go up to 3 lakh rupees. That is one. And also the Direct Taxes Code talked about, widening of tax slabs. So these are two important issues which were there in the Direct Taxes Code, and I think it's time that the government really relooks at both and have it implemented in the current year's budget.
Okay. When you speak about inflation, the other point that comes to my mind is the standard deduction that's available for salaried individuals. I mean, earlier you had a separate slab for medical and conveyance, and then we had FM Jaitley saying that, I'm just going to give you a standard allowance of 40,000 rupees. So that subsumed your medical and conveyance. Then it was hiked to 50,000 rupees. But again, if we look at inflation, which is a key problem right now, do you think that 50,000 rupees is adequate for a salaried individual to have their medical and conveyance sort of subsumed into, or that as well needs to be hiked? Divya.
See, there's clearly a case for an hike in standard deduction. As you rightly said, there was conveyance allowance which was given to employees, and there was medical reimbursement. When we club both, the limit was almost 35,000 rupees. Now, even when you increase the standard deduction to 50,000, the additional benefit is only 15,000 rupees to a salaried individual. And with the avenues of tax planning being very less for salaried class, it's really time for the standard deduction to be increased from 50 to at least 75,000, because the net benefit earlier was almost 15,000 rupees, not more than that, if we take away the transport allowance as well as the medical reimbursement. So clearly there's a case to increase it from 50 to at least 75,000.
At least 75,000. All right. I want to touch upon the other topic,
Just one more point that I would like to add to this is there was some numbers which were brought out by the finance budget in 2018, which was the average tax paid by a business person, including professionals, was approximately 25,000. And the average tax paid by a salaried individual was about 76,000.
True.
So if the salaried person is actually paying 3 times what a professional is paying, I think a hike in standard deduction is justified. I mean, just a simple example, if I had a business, the expenses for my motor vehicle would have been charged to my business, right? But for a salaried income, I don't have the conveyance allowance. So can I not ask for a hike in the standard deduction?
Fair point. Yes, it's, I suppose, a fair demand. The other investment avenues, or rather should I say deduction avenues available, are your ATD, which again has been quite stagnant. It's been at that 25,000 rupee level, and yes, for senior citizens it's at 30,000 rupees. You know, it's only on your dependents, it's only on your dependent children. Do you think then, Renu, that as well needs to be relooked?
Definitely. I think the medical sector needs a lot of focus. I think a couple of things that they can actually do. In fact, related to ATC also, if I can go back, there could also be a recommendation for a healthcare fund, for example. Because the government is focusing on health and wellness. There's this Ayushman Bharat that they have announced. So you need to set up 150 wellness centers. So maybe having a separate healthcare fund, for example, very similar to a PPF could be one option. On this ATD, definitely, I think because the medical insurance has gone up, medical has become very expensive, right? Medical insurance has gone up, so obviously the premium on such insurance has gone up, and therefore I think the limit definitely needs to be increased. Similarly for senior dependent parents, and also for preventive health checkups. I think the current limit is like 5,000, which is nothing. So at least 20,000 for preventive health checkups.
Again, I think that whole point of inflation, right?
Correct.
These tax slabs, these deductions really need to keep up with the inflation, which has again come roaring back. I mean, the last CPI number is something that's reflective of that.
And also with the cost of medical going up, you know, it's not the medical, the healthcare cost which was there few years back is not there now. It's much higher than what it was there. So it's important that we have to be in line with the current scenario also.
I just have a quick question. Do you think infra bonds should make a comeback? I mean, do you think that was a lucrative tax option for investors?
See, infra bond was introduced only for 1 year. And that time the law said it should be 20,000 rupees. But I think it's time to introduce that. And the reason being that if we see what the finance minister has been talking about, we need about 1 lakh crore rupees for the infrastructure, and infrastructure is key for the development and growth of the country and the economy. And it's time that these infra bonds should come back, and with a higher limit, because A, that provides a tax deduction to the individuals who are subscribing to it, and also it meets the infrastructure requirements of the country. So clearly there's a case to bring infra bonds back. I don't know why it was stopped only after 1 year, but yes, the government needs to really relook at that, with a higher limit.
What do you think of the popularity of the National Pension Scheme, the NPS? That as well was it's a relatively new investment instrument, but I think the fact that it's giving you that 50,000 rupees extra, I think has added value. But of course, again, NPS is something that's market oriented. Of course, it's an investment / savings instrument, but it does bring in again that element of volatility because it's not a fixed instrument like PPF or PF. What do you think of the NPS?
See, the government over the last couple of years has been really focusing on NPS, and the idea is that how we can move towards a society where, you know, you are also not dependent on your pension, but you also make investments. And clearly NPS is one area which has seen some lucrative movements over the last couple of years, especially last 1 year with the government focusing on that. And I think there are two things which need to be done. One is the additional contribution of 50,000 that should be increased. And the other is that the employer's contribution, which was 10% as available as deduction, for government employees is 14%. I think it's time to relook at that and maybe increase it to 14 for non-government also.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, I'm going to move on and talk about real estate. I mean, we know what's been happening with the realty sector. When we look outside our window, all we see are just those empty grey blocks. That's essentially stagnation, right, in the construction of real estate. Right now, you have, like you mentioned, you know, the principal amount and the deduction on interest. Where do you think the rejigs are needed so that, you know, investors go out, I mean, you know, assessees go out and say that, okay, you know what, I want to buy that property because I'm getting these tax breaks. Where do you think the rejigs are needed?
So I think if there were two major asks of any salaried person, it would be one, of course, for the rejig of the tax rate, which include ATC and the standard deduction. And the second priority would be the housing sector. Again, if you follow the government's motto of, providing housing to all by 2020, I think there's a great need to incentivize people to buy property. Okay, so one, of course, is to increase the deduction of interest to 3 lakhs. I think the other one is the budget had capped the housing loss to 2 lakhs. The budget of 2017 had capped it to 2 lakhs. Now, this is not a realistic number because, of course, they allow the loss to be carried forward for 8 years, and the loss can be set off only against income from house property. Having said that, the initial years, the EMIs go into interest. So most of the time, the interest is higher than the rental income. So having an individual trying to recoup the losses over 8 years is not really a realistic number, because if you don't have a positive house income, there's no way am I going to be able to offset the losses. So I think, one, of course, the loss amount needs to be increased from 2 lakhs to 3 lakhs maybe, but I think more importantly, they need to allow the loss to be set off in the same year itself and against any other head of income. I think that is one major factor.
Okay. What about affordable housing? Because I remember, I think in the last budget, the last to last budget, there was that additional 1.5 lakh deduction allowed. But your house property should be below 45 lakh rupees. Now, I don't think there are a lot of properties, especially in a metro like, Mumbai or Delhi or Chennai or Bangalore, where the house value is going to be 45 lakh rupees. Do you think that cap of the value of the house should be increased?
See, affordable housing actually needs 2 changes. One, in terms of the value, you rightly said 45 lakhs is not a big amount, and if you go even to tier 2 cities as well, you can get a house on average would be about 50-60 lakhs, so that really needs to go up. And also the limit, they had said that for loans availed up to 31st March 20, I think that needs to go to 21. Definitely that is what government will look at, but the limit also needs to go up from 45 to a higher number.
Okay. All right.
I think not just this whole thing will not just give the tax break. I think it will be a big boost to the realty sector also.
Of course,
Because I think if you look at globally, I think India the housing sector is probably one of the most expensive. So, giving some tax breaks on the financing cost can actually make it on par with US and Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when they say also that, okay, pricing is higher in India, the problem is that it's the affordability bit, because our incomes have stagnated, and, the prices have just gone up by that little bit. So if you look at it, it's actually the affordability, and I think that's the key problem in India, which continues to be, and I think that's the reason why people are going for rent as well. I mean, rent is becoming a big, because the yields are so low in India. So I suppose, that could be a fair problem. Okay, I wanted to talk to you about this issue that you've spoken about, and that's FTC. As India has this growing internationally mobile population, you've spoken about 2 things. One is, withholding of the FTC credit, and the second is ESOPs. What do you propose? What are the current issues being faced by such internationally mobile employees and their employers as well? And what do you propose the current budget should have?
See, there are 2 aspects which are important from an internationally mobile population perspective. One is the foreign tax credit at the withholding stage. So if I look at an Indian who is going and working overseas, who qualifies as a resident in India, he will, and the salary is paid in India. So under the Indian tax laws, the tax needs to be withheld, and you cannot claim a credit for foreign taxes that he pays overseas. So what happens is that the tax is withheld at a higher rate, and in the return you claim a foreign tax credit, which means that you have to then apply for a refund. So it becomes a cash flow issue also. And if I look at other sections which is not linked to withholding tax, you get credit for under section 90 or 91 for taxes, prepaid taxes. So it's important that the foreign tax credit withholding stage is looked at by the government, because it will ease out the cash flow issue also. The other on the ESOPs, because ESOP is something which is very prevalent amongst the internationally mobile population, and if someone works in India for a proportionate period and you are a resident, then you get taxed on full income on allotment of shares. So especially for people who qualify as non-resident or not ordinarily resident, there's a case to really tax ESOPs on the proportionate time that they spend in India, which is what has been recommended by the OECD also. So I think these are the 2 areas which impact internationally mobile population and needs a relook in the budget.
And now, of course, that one most contentious topic, and that's long-term capital gains. I think FM Jaitley displeased the street, if you could call it that, by introducing that tax. You could say that it was overdue, etc. But again, it's important to stoke investor sentiment as well. So first, I'll get in your perspective, Divya, on this. LTCG 10% if it's more than a lakh in that 1 year time frame. Do you think that was fair? Do you think it could be enhanced, the limit? Do you think the definition of long term could be tweaked?
I think the limit definitely needs to go up from 1 lakh to at least 2 lakhs. That will help boosting the capital markets. And even the period should be looked at. Okay. So definitely, I agree, the sentiments were dampened, but it's time to see how they can make it more beneficial. Yeah.
But how do you picture this, Renu? It's not like India is the only country that taxes long-term capital gains. So one may wonder that, hey, why are you complaining so much? And plus, India it's a growing economy. We are one of the few countries. In fact, I think we're the only country who can still say that, look, we have potential to grow at 6%, etc. Even China can't boast about that, right? So why not tax long-term capital gains, especially when, like we mentioned, the government does have this entire fiscal deficit problem. So, you want the exemption limit to be raised, you want maybe surcharge as well to be removed if the DTC is asking for it, and then you say you don't want LTCG either. So what's your own view of that?
So I think I do agree with all this. There would be a reduction in the taxable income, but I think the positive side is you'll have more purchasing power. You'll have more consumption possibilities, right? So this is a boost to the economy. So if I have more and I think recently what I was reading was the proportion of household savings has actually declined. And according to me, that was one of the major redeeming factors of the Indian economy. So if I don't have disposable income, if there's no consumption, how am I going to boost the economy? So yes, there would be a reduction in tax. So I'm not denying it. But look at it the positive side. If I have consumption, if I have disposable income,
of course,
I can definitely boost the economy.
Okay, so just to summarize, sure, do you want to?
I was going to do.
Sure, go ahead.
So what I want to say was that it's time that yes, the fiscal deficit aspect is there. Yes. But it's time that the economy comes in that running mode with more purchasing power in the hands of the individuals, because the more disposable income you have, the more money goes into the market, which is really helpful. Yeah.
And I suppose this last GDP number, this last inflation number may have spooked the ministry as well. So let's hope. So just closing comments from you guys. Divya, over to you first. From an individual perspective, what are the top 2-3 things you hope the finance minister announces from a direct tax point of view?
Top 2 things?
Yes.
The rejig of the income slab, and the tax rates coming down, and a relook at the ATC.
All right. And Renu, what about you from an industry perspective? What do you think the finance minister, what will please you basically in this budget, what the finance minister will announce?
So I think definitely ease of doing business through this e-assessment, faceless assessment, but obviously making sure the processes are right, the systems are correct. I think that would be one big from the industry. And 2, obviously simplification of the execution of the ITR forms.
And I think as all of us, as an individual perspective, I'm sure that one thing that's on top of our head is that the tax rates should go down, because at the end of the day, we want more money to take back home. So let's cross our fingers and hope that come 1st Feb, the finance minister grants all of your wishes. But with that, Renu as well as Divya, thank you so much for joining us on this very special edition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.